The silence of the chapel was a smothering thing. It pressed in on Clara, heavy as a wool blanket in the summer heat, smelling of dry wood and the faint, cloying scent of the wilted wildflowers someone had placed on the altar. Through the single-arched window, the sun beat down on a world bleached white and gold, a world of rock and dust that seemed to stretch on into eternity. Outside that window, Mr. Horace Gable was waiting. He would be standing by the door, a thick, solid man smelling of tobacco and leather and a proprietary satisfaction she had come to dread. He was twice her age, with a salt and pepper beard that could not hide the sag of his jowls, and hands calloused from a life of roping cattle and counting coin. He was her future, a respectable future. Her father had called it a necessary one. Clara's fingers twisted in the folds of the white dress. It was not a dress of her choosing. It was a dress meant to signify purity, a clean slate, a lie so stark and bright it might blind anyone who looked too closely. Her first engagement had ended in whispers, in sideways glances and slammed doors, a moment of youthful, foolish grief over another, mistaken for something far worse by a fiancé with a brittle pride. The rumors he had sown had grown like weeds, choking her name until it was synonymous with shame. And so, her father, a man whose own holdings bordered Gable's vast ranch, had arranged this. Not a marriage, but a transaction. A deed signed in holy matrimony to merge land and launder a daughter's reputation. She could hear the low murmur of voices from outside, her father's, anxious and placating, Mr. Gable's, a low rumble of impatience. They would give her another minute, perhaps two, before one of them came for her. In her mind's eye, she saw the rest of her life spooling out, the quiet dinners where her opinion was not sought, the heavy hand on her shoulder, the nights spent staring at a ceiling in a house that was not a home, a prisoner of her own rescue. The thought was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. She would not be a ghost in her own life. Not again. Her gaze fell upon the small sacristy door at the side of the altar. It led to the back, where the preacher kept his horse and buggy. It was a servant's entrance, an escape. The decision was not a thought, but a fire that caught in her veins. Before it could burn out, she moved. The dress, with its ridiculous lace and seed pearls, snagged on the rough-hewn pews. She heard a seam rip, a small, violent sound in the crushing silence. She did not care. She pushed through the sacristy door into a dusty, cluttered room. Beyond its back door stood a sturdy-looking sorrel, tethered loosely to a post, already saddled. The preacher's horse, a sin. To steal from a man of God. But what was one more sin when she was already damned in the eyes of the world? Her hands trembled as she worked the knot. The horse tossed its head, its eyes rolling, but it did not shy away. She gathered the torn, cumbersome skirts of her dress, bundling them in one hand, and hauled herself into the saddle. It was an clumsy, graceless mount, nothing like the side saddle she was used to, but she was up. She did not look back. Kicking the sorrel into a trot, she guided it away from the chapel, not toward the main road, but into the scrub and rock of the high desert. The trot became a canter, then a desperate, pounding gallop. The wind tore at her veil, ripping it from her hair and sending it cartwheeling back toward the life she was leaving behind. The sun was a hammer, and the white dress was a beacon. But she rode on, the rhythm of the horse's hooves a prayer for distance, for oblivion. Hundreds of miles away, though in a landscape just as unforgiving. Eli rode at a walk. His horse, a lean buckskin with a watchful eye, moved with the steady, ground-eating pace of an animal that knew its business. Eli's posture was easy in the saddle, but his eyes were not. They scanned the horizon, the shimmer of heat rising from the baked earth, the shadows pooling beneath the skeletal arms of saguaros. He was a man who noticed things, a broken branch, the track of a sidewinder, the distant circling of a hawk. It was a habit learned in a place where not noticing things could get a man killed. He had been out of the Yuma prison for 3 months. 3 months of sleeping under the stars, of taking small jobs on ranches where the foreman didn't ask too many questions, of keeping his head down and his mouth shut. The 4 years inside had scoured him down to bone and quiet resolve. They had taught him the weight of a single, reckless act. He'd done it to save a friend, a boy no older than 17 who'd gotten crossways with a cruel blacksmith. When the smith had raised a hammer, Eli had raised his fists. He had not meant to kill the man, but the man was dead all the same, and the law did not much care for the reasons why. Now, all he wanted was to find a place quiet enough to forget the sound of a cell door closing. He was headed north, toward the territories, where a man's past might be shed like a snake's skin. He carried little, a bedroll, a canteen, a bit of jerky, and a letter in his saddlebag that he had never opened. The paper was worn soft as cloth from the touch of his fingers. The ink faded, but the guilt it represented was as fresh as the day it was written. He made camp that evening in the shadow of a rock formation that clawed at the bruised purple sky. It was a decent spot, with a little grass for the horse and a natural overhang that would offer some shelter if the weather turned. He built a small, smokeless fire, more for comfort than for warmth, and was chewing on a piece of jerky when he heard it, a sound that did not belong, the stumble and fall of something heavy, followed by a low, ragged gasp. He was on his feet in an instant, hand resting on the butt of the pistol holstered at his hip. He moved without a sound, circling around the edge of the rocks, and then he saw her. She was a heap of white linen and dark hair, sprawled on the ground not 30 yards from his camp. For a moment, he thought he was seeing a ghost, a heat-dazzled vision. But ghosts did not bleed. A dark stain was spreading on the rocks near her head. He approached slowly, his boots making no sound on the sandy soil. She was alive. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, hitching breaths. He knelt, his eyes taking in the impossible sight of her. A wedding dress, torn to ribbons at the hem and streaked with grime and what looked like blood. Her hair, the color of dark honey, had come loose from its pins and was fanned out in the dust. One of her feet was bare, the ankle already beginning to swell. He was a man who had sworn off trouble, and this woman was trouble walking, or crawling, as the case may be. His first instinct was to mount his horse and ride away, leave her to whatever fate she was running from. But then she moaned, a soft, pitiful sound, and he saw the youth in her face, beneath the dirt and the exhaustion. She looked no older than 20. He thought of the boy he'd tried to defend, of the helplessness in his eyes. With a curse under his breath, he holstered his pistol. He gently turned her over. Her eyes fluttered open, wide with a wild, cornered animal terror. She tried to scramble backward, pushing herself up with her elbows, but a sharp cry of pain escaped her lips, and she fell back. "Easy now," he said, his voice low and rough from disuse. "I am not going to hurt you." He reached for his canteen, uncorked it, and held it to her cracked lips. She stared at him, her eyes a startling shade of blue, dark with suspicion. But thirst was a powerful master. She drank, gulping the water down greedily. When he pulled the canteen away, she watched him, her jaw set, her silence a wall between them. He tended to her without a word. The gash on her forehead was shallow, already clotting. He cleaned it as best he could with a strip of cloth torn from his own shirt and a little water. Her ankle was a different matter. It was badly sprained, twisted and angry-looking. He soaked another rag in cool water and wrapped it gently around the swelling. She winced, biting her lip so hard he thought she might draw blood, but she made no other sound. He led her, half carrying her, back to his small camp and sat her down with her back against the rock wall. He handed her a piece of jerky. She took it, her fingers brushing his, and he felt a tremor run through her. She ate it slowly, methodically, as if forcing herself to perform a necessary task. Throughout it all, she did not speak, not a word of thanks, not a single question. She just watched him with those haunted blue eyes. Eli understood silence. He knew it could be a shield or a prison. He let her have hers. He checked on his horse, added a few more sticks to the fire, and settled on the other side of it, giving her as much space as the small campsite would allow. The sun had set, and the desert air was growing cool. The stars emerged, cold and brilliant in the black sky. He did not ask her name, nor where she had come from, nor why she was wearing a ruined wedding dress in the middle of nowhere. Questions were a currency he could not afford to spend, and he figured she was in the same predicament. Trouble was best left to its own devices. Come morning, he would give her some water and what was left of his food, and he would ride on. The decision brought him no comfort. Sometime in the deep of the night, he was woken by the scuff of a boot on stone. His eyes snapped open. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint red glow. The woman was gone. He was on his feet in a second, listening. He heard a sharp intake of breath, then a muffled sob of pain, coming from the direction of the trail. She had not gotten far. He found her a dozen yards away, collapsed again, her face pale in the moonlight. She was clutching her injured ankle, her body trembling with a mixture of pain and frustration. He stood over her, a tall shadow, and this time there was no softness in his voice. "What in God's name do you think you are doing?" She looked up at him, defiance flashing in her eyes. "Leaving?" The word was a raw whisper. "Leaving to where? You cannot walk. You will die out here." "That is my concern." He hunkered down, bringing his face level with hers. The smell of dust and sweat and something like faded flowers clung to her. "It becomes my concern when I find you half dead near my camp. It becomes my concern when your foolish pride gets you killed on my watch. Now, who are you running from?" She flinched as if he had struck her. "I am running from no one." "Everyone out here is running from someone," he said, his voice hard. "Or something. I have seen that look in your eyes before. I saw it in the mirror this morning. So I will ask you again. Who is after you?" She pressed her lips together, a stubborn line. Just then, a low rumble echoed across the canyon lands. It was not thunder, not yet, but the promise of it. A breeze, sudden and cool, kicked up dust from the trail, carrying the scent of rain. Eli looked up at the sky. The stars were disappearing, swallowed by a bank of thick, dark clouds rolling in from the west. "We need to get back to the shelter," he said, his tone urgent. "Now!" He did not wait for her agreement. He scooped her up into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, all sharp angles and fragile bones beneath the ruined dress. She stiffened, a gasp escaping her, but she did not fight him. He carried her back to the overhang just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. The wind picked up, howling through the rocks, and the rumble became a deafening crash of thunder that seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the stark landscape in a series of brilliant, terrifying flashes. The rain came down in a solid sheet, a gray curtain that cut them off from the world. It was a violent cleansing storm. Eli built up the fire, the flames pushing back the damp chill. He sat on one side of the fire, she on the other, knees drawn to her chest. The small, protected space felt intensely intimate. For a long time, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the roar of the storm outside. "I was to be married today," she said, her voice so quiet he almost did not hear her over the rain. He looked at her. Her face was illuminated by the firelight, her eyes fixed on the flames. "To a man my father chose for me. A good man. They said, a wealthy man. He would have given me a fine home. He would have protected my name." She gave a small, bitter laugh. What was left of it? Eli waited, saying nothing. He knew this kind of confession. It was not for him, not really. It was for the storm, for the anonymous dark. "There was another before," she whispered, her voice catching. I thought we were to be married, but his pride was a fragile thing. He saw me weeping one afternoon. He thought I was crying for another man, a boy from my youth who had passed on. I was crying for the loss, for the way life changes without your consent. But he did not see that. He saw betrayal. He called me. He said things. He told people I was not pure of heart or body. In a town like ours, a whisper like that is a death sentence. She fell silent, wrapping her arms around herself as if to hold her splintered pieces together. So my father found Mr. Gable, she continued, the name spoken like a curse. To save me, to save the family from disgrace, and I would have done it. I walked all the way to the altar, but I looked out the window, at the desert, and I saw so much space, so much quiet, and I knew I would rather die out there, alone, than suffocate in a house built on a lie. She finally looked at him, her eyes swimming with unshed tears. He would have owned me. My father sold me to him, like a prize heifer. Eli felt an old, familiar anger stir in his gut. He knew what it was to be owned, to have your choices stripped away until all you had left was the will to endure. You are not livestock, he said, the words coming out harsher than he intended. He cleared his throat. And you are not dead. A small, watery smile touched her lips. No, not yet. She held out a hand, her slender fingers pale in the firelight. They call me Clara. He hesitated for only a second. Eli. It was an exchange, a fragile bridge built across a chasm of distrust. The storm raged on for hours. Sometime before dawn, exhaustion finally claimed her, and Clara slumped sideways, her head coming to rest against a saddlebag. Eli watched her for a long time, the firelight catching the tear tracks on her dusty cheeks. He felt a pull, a sense of connection to this broken, defiant woman that he did not want and could not afford. She was trouble, just as he'd first thought, but she was also brave. The storm passed as quietly as it had arrived. The dawn broke clear and cool. The air washed clean. The world smelled of wet sage and damp earth. When Clara awoke, stiff and sore, the first thing she noticed was the silence. The second was that she was alone under the overhang. She sat up, her heart lurching. Panic seized her. Had he left her? She pushed herself to her feet, her sprained ankles screaming in protest, and hobbled to the edge of the shelter. He was there, by the remains of the fire, his back to her. His horse was saddled, his bedroll tied neatly behind it. He was packing the last of his few belongings into his saddlebags. He was ready to ride. He must have heard her, because he turned. His face was unreadable, his eyes shadowed by the brim of his hat. He gestured with his chin toward a small bundle on a rock near where she had slept. There is water in the canteen, and the last of the jerky, he said, his voice flat. Someone will find you, eventually. She stared at him, then looked past him, at the trail they had taken to get here. It was gone. In its place was a muddy, impassable torrent of water, a newly born river cutting through the canyon path. The storm had flooded the way back. They were stranded. He had to have known that. Clara looked from the flooded path to the vast, unknown expanse of the canyon land stretching out before them. Then she looked at him, this quiet, haunted stranger who had shown her a rough kindness. He was turning to his horse, ready to mount, ready to leave her behind in this wild, lonely place. She was being given a choice. Stay here, a victim waiting to be found, to be dragged back to a life that was a prison, or follow the only other soul in this desolate world, a man with his own ghosts, into a wilderness that promised nothing but uncertainty and danger. Wait, she called out, her voice stronger than she expected it to be. Eli paused, his hand on the saddle horn, and looked at her over his shoulder. The rising sun caught the edge of the canyon, setting it ablaze with light. It was a terrifying, beautiful country, a place where a person could get lost forever, or a place where they could begin again. He watched her across the dying fire, saw the set of her jaw and the desperate hope warring with fear in her eyes. Everything in him, every instinct honed by years of trouble and regret, screamed at him to say no. This woman was a magnet for the very things he was trying to outrun. Tying his fate to hers was like tying himself to a millstone and stepping into a river. But he looked at the flooded path behind them, and then at the raw, unforgiving wilderness ahead. And he knew he could not leave her. To abandon her would be its own kind of crime, a quiet one that would haunt him just as surely as the ghost of the man he had killed. "I am not going back," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I will go with you." Eli let out a long breath, his shoulders slumping in weary resignation. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. "Get your things. What is left of them?" That was all. No welcome, no reassurance, just a grudging acceptance that was more of a burden taken up than a partnership formed. Clara did not care. Relief washed over her so powerfully her knees felt weak. She gathered the canteen and the jerky, her movements clumsy with haste, afraid he might change his mind. He helped her onto his horse, swinging up behind her in a single fluid motion. She was pressed against him, the solid wall of his chest at her back, his arm a steady presence around her waist to keep her balanced. The intimacy of it was jarring, a stark contrast to the cold distance in his voice. She tried to hold herself rigid, to take up as little space as possible, but with every step the horse took, she settled back against him. They rode toward a place he knew of only by name, Broken Mesa, a town, he had said, that was big enough to get lost in and mean enough to not care who you were, so long as you had coin or a strong back. It was a 2-day ride, he estimated, through country that grew harsher with every mile. The journey was a lesson in survival. Eli was a creature of this barren land, as much a part of it as the hawks that circled overhead. He moved with a purpose that was both silent and profound. He taught her, through sparse words and clear action, how to read the landscape. He showed her which plants held water in their roots, how to spot the trail of a rattlesnake, how to listen to the changing pitch of the wind for signs of a dust storm. She was a quick study, her senses sharpened by the constant, low-humming fear of what lay behind her. She shed the last vestiges of the woman she had been, the woman who worried about social graces and the proper way to pour tea. That woman could not survive here. Along the trail, they saw evidence of the land's cruelty. They passed the skeletal remains of a burned-out wagon, its cargo of shattered pottery and rusted tools strewn across the dust like broken teeth. Blackened timbers were all that was left of a family's dream. Clara stared, her stomach churning, imagining the screams and the chaos. Eli merely glanced at it, his eyes cold and assessing, before urging his horse onward. He did not need to see the aftermath to know the story. Later that day, they saw riders on a distant ridge, 5 of them, their figures dark and predatory against the skyline. They were not cowboys or prospectors. They rode with the loose-limbed, watchful arrogance of men who took what they wanted and answered to no one. Eli pulled their horse into the concealment of a dry wash, waiting without a word until the riders had passed. He held a hand over Clara's arm, a silent command to stay still, and she could feel the tension coiled in his body, a tightly wound spring ready to snap. The silence in that wash was absolute, broken only by the sound of her own heart hammering against her ribs. At night, when they made their cold camp, they would sometimes hear the distant pop of a rifle, or see the flicker of a fire far across the plains that was not a settler's hearth. He told her there were wars brewing in this territory. Unseen battles fought over water rights and grazing land. The old ranching families, the ones who had been here for generations, were being squeezed by newcomers with government deeds and fences. It was a land of quiet, simmering violence, where a disagreement could be settled with a rope or a bullet, and the law was whichever man had the most guns. In these long days and tense nights, Clara began to see the man behind the silence. Eli was burdened. It was more than the weariness of a man on the run. It was a grief so deep it seemed to have settled into his bones. It was in the way he stared into the fire, his eyes seeing something far beyond the flames. It was in the tightness of his jaw when he thought she was not looking. And it was in the letter. He carried it in his saddlebag, wrapped in oilcloth. A few times. She saw him take it out. He would run his thumb over the faded address, his expression a mixture of pain and longing, but he never opened it. He would hold it for a few minutes, as if drawing some sort of penance from its weight, and then wrap it carefully and put it away again. The letter was a locked room inside him, and she knew instinctively that whatever haunted him was trapped in its pages. He never spoke of family, of a home, of a time before the hardness had settled on him. When she had asked once, trying to fill the oppressive silence, where he was from, he had simply said, "A place I cannot go back to." It was the same answer she would have given. In that, they were the same. Two people defined not by where they were from, but by what they had fled. Broken Mesa appeared out of the heat shimmer as a jagged line of false-fronted buildings on a dusty plateau. It looked like a town that had been thrown together in a hurry and left to bake in the sun. As they drew closer, the sounds reached them. The tinny notes of a piano, the ring of a blacksmith's hammer, the murmur and occasional shout of men's voices. The main street was a wide, rutted track of dirt, lined with a saloon, a general store, a land office, and a dozen other clapboard structures in various states of disrepair. There was an air of suspicion about the place. Men watched them ride in from the shaded porches of the saloons, their eyes lingering on Clara. Women peered from behind curtains, their faces pinched with disapproval at the sight of her. A woman in a ruined dress riding with a hard-looking stranger. Every glance felt like an accusation. "We need a story," Eli said, his voice a low murmur near her ear as they dismounted in front of the livery. "We are man and wife, headed west to meet your family. Our wagon broke an axle a ways back. We lost most everything." Clara's heart skipped a beat. Man and wife. It was a practical lie, a shield, but the words hung in the air between them, feeling both dangerous and strangely true. "All right," she whispered, her throat dry. "Do not talk much," he instructed. "Let me handle it." The town was as corrupt as it looked. Eli learned quickly that the sheriff, a beefy man with a stained vest and a lazy eye, was in the pocket of a rancher named Silas Croft, a man who owned half the valley and was squeezing the other half dry. Croft's men swaggered through the town like they owned it, which, Clara supposed, they practically did. In Broken Mesa, justice was a commodity, and people like her and Eli, with no money and no connections, were little more than dust under the boots of men like Croft. Clara, calling herself Mrs. Cole, found work at the only boarding house in town. The owner, a stern widow named Mrs. Gable, the shared name with the man she'd fled, sent a chill down her spine, hired her to work in the kitchen. It was grueling, thankless labor, from dawn until long after dusk. Her hands, once soft, became red and raw from peeling potatoes and scrubbing pots with harsh lye soap. But the kitchen was a small, windowless room at the back of the house, a place to be invisible. She took a tiny room in the attic, a space so small she could touch both walls at once, and was grateful for it. Eli found work with Silas Croft himself. The rancher needed a man who was not afraid to break wild mustangs, and Eli had a quiet, fearless way with horses. The work was brutal, and the pay was a pittance, but it was work. He slept in the bunkhouse at the Croft Ranch, but every evening, he would walk into town and stand across the street from the boarding house. He would wait in the shadows until he saw the lamp in her attic room flicker on, a tiny pinprick of light in the darkness. Only then would he walk back to the ranch. He never came over, never spoke to her, but his presence was a silent watch, a thread connecting them in this hostile place. Weeks bled into a month. The rhythm of their lives became one of weary survival. But the world they had outrun had long arms. A traveling salesman passing through town spoke of a scandal back east, of a wealthy bride who had vanished from the altar, leaving a powerful ranch baron humiliated. The story was told as a piece of juicy gossip in the boarding house dining room, and Clara, carrying a tray of biscuits, felt the blood drain from her face. The description was vague. The names were not mentioned, but she knew. The whispers had followed her. Her anxiety became a constant, gnawing companion. She started at shadows, flinched when men raised their voices. She felt the net closing in around her. One evening, Eli found her behind the boarding house, tossing scraps to a stray dog. "I heard the talk," he said, his voice low. "We should go, now, before it gets worse." Clara shook her head, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "No." "No?" He sounded incredulous. "They are looking for you, a man like the one you left. He will have sent people, Pinkertons. Maybe they will find you here." "And where would we go, Eli?" she demanded, her voice rising with a desperation that had been building for weeks. "Another town just like this one, and another after that? I am tired of running. I am tired of being afraid. I have done nothing wrong." "It does not matter what you did or did not do," he said, his voice hard. "It matters what they think you did. It matters that they are powerful and we are not. That is the only truth that counts out here." "Then I will make a new truth," she said, more to convince herself than him. She would not let fear be her master anymore. Here in this awful, dusty town. She was a cook who earned her own keep. It was not much, but it was hers. It was a life she had chosen, not one she had been forced into. He looked at her for a long moment, his face a mask of frustration and something else she could not name. He turned and left without another word. The argument hung between them, a fresh wound. The following night, the boarding house was rowdier than usual. A group of craftsmen were in town, flush with their meager pay and determined to drink it away. One of them, a big red-faced man named Boone, took a particular interest in Clara. He cornered her as she was clearing plates, his breath sour with whiskey. "Well now, pretty thing," he slurred, his hand clamping down on her arm. "You are too fine to be hauling slop. A woman like you should be pouring drinks. For me." "Please let go of me," Clara said, trying to keep her voice steady, trying to pull her arm away. His grip only tightened. "I ain't done with you," he growled, his eyes roaming over her dress. "Maybe after your work is done. You and me can—" He did not get to finish the sentence. A shadow fell over their table. Eli stood there, his face carved from stone. He had come into the kitchen entrance to wait for her, as he often did on nights the saloon was full. "She said to let go." Eli's voice was dangerously quiet. Boone looked up, a sneer on his face. "This ain't your concern, horsebreaker. Me and the missus are just getting acquainted." He gave Clara's arm a vicious squeeze. Clara saw something shift in Eli's eyes. The quiet control he always maintained simply vanished, replaced by a cold, white-hot fury. It happened so fast she barely saw it. One moment Boone was sneering. The next, he was on the floor, sputtering, blood pouring from his mouth. Eli had not just hit him. He had moved with a brutal, devastating efficiency. He hauled the bigger man to his feet and hit him again. A sharp, cracking sound that silenced the entire dining room. Boone crumpled and did not get back up. Eli stood over him, his chest heaving, his hands clenched into bloody fists. He looked up, and his wild gaze swept the room of stunned onlookers before it landed on Clara. The fury in his eyes was replaced by a flash of raw panic, the look of a man who had just revealed a part of himself he had tried to keep buried forever. He turned and walked out the back door into the night. The chaos that erupted behind him was a distant roar to Clara. "Missus!" Gable was screaming. Men were shouting. She ignored all of it. She grabbed a bowl of water and a clean rag and followed him. She found him in the deep shadows of the livery stable, leaning against a post, his head bowed. His hands were a mess, the knuckles split and bleeding. She came to him without a word and took one of his hands in hers. He flinched but did not pull away. Gently, she began to clean the blood and grime from the wounds. "You should not have done that," she whispered, her voice thick. "He touched you," he said, his voice a raw rasp. He would not look at her. "Now Croft will fire you. The sheriff will come. They will know who we are." "I know," he said. He sounded defeated. "I know." She finished cleaning his hands, her touch lingering on his skin. The air in the stable was thick with the smell of hay and horses and the storm that had just passed between them. The tension was a living thing. A cord pulled taut. He finally raised his head and looked at her. His eyes, in the gloom, were full of a terrible sorrow. She did not know who moved first. Perhaps they both did. But suddenly his hands were in her hair, and his mouth was on hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was desperate, hungry, freighted with all the fear and loneliness and unspoken longing that had simmered between them for weeks. It was a kiss of shared desperation, a raw and aching confession. She clung to him, her fingers digging into his arms, pouring all her terror and her burgeoning hope into the embrace. For a fleeting, breathless moment, she was not alone. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. He broke away, stumbling back a step, his breathing ragged. He looked at her as if she were the source of all his pain. "I cannot," he choked out, shaking his head. "Clara, you deserve better than this. Better than me." Before she could speak, before she could tell him that he was wrong, that all she wanted was this, he was gone, melting back into the darkness, leaving her alone in the shadows of the stable, the ghost of his kiss burning on her lips. She stood there for a long time, her body trembling. He thought he was protecting her by pushing her away, but he did not understand. He did not see the change that had taken root in her heart. As she stood there, the cool night air raising goosebumps on her skin, Clara realized a terrifying new truth. Her dream was no longer simply about escape from the past. It was beginning to look a lot like Eli. It was a dream of starting over, of building something new on the broken ground of their lives. And that dream, she knew, was the most dangerous one of all. The man who arrived in Broken Mesa did not look like trouble, but Eli knew the scent of it, and this man was soaked in it. He came in on the afternoon stage, a quiet man in a dusty city suit and a derby hat that seemed out of place under the fierce western sun. He was not a rancher or a prospector or a drummer. He carried no weapons that were visible, but he moved with a coiled stillness that was more dangerous than any holstered gun. He took a room at the boarding house and spent his days sitting on the porch, watching. He did not watch the cowboys or the wagons. He watched the people. He was a hunter, and the town was his hunting ground. Clara saw him on her second day. She was sweeping the porch when he tipped his hat to her, his eyes a pale, washed-out blue that seemed to see right through her. They held no warmth, only a placid, unnerving curiosity. She gave a curt nod and hurried back to the sanctuary of her kitchen, her heart thumping a frightened rhythm against her ribs. Later, from the kitchen window, she saw him talking to Sheriff Miller. The sheriff, usually so blustering and self-important, was deferential, nodding along to whatever the stranger was saying. The man in the derby hat passed the sheriff a slip of paper, and Miller's eyes widened slightly before he pocketed it. The quiet man was buying information. He was buying the law. The name came to her a day later, carried on the saloon chatter that drifted through the boarding house walls. She was scrubbing a pot when she heard a cowboy talking to one of Croft's men. "That Pinkerton fella," he said, his voice low. "He is asking about a runaway. Some rich man's bride from back east, name of Clara." The pot slipped from her numb fingers and crashed to the floor. The sound was deafening in the small kitchen. Her past had a name, and a man had been sent to collect it, And her. Eli felt the shift in the town's currents, too, after the fight with Boone. Silas Croft had kept him on, grudgingly. A man who could fight like that was a useful tool, even if he was a dangerous one. But now, Eli's finely tuned survival instincts, the ones that had kept him alive in Yuma, were screaming. He saw the way the Pinkertons' gaze would drift toward the boarding house. He saw the new, hunted look in Clara's eyes. He saw the net, woven of money and whispers, being drawn tight around them. He did not push her away anymore. The kiss in the stable had broken something open in him, a door he had long kept barred. He could not bring himself to touch her again, terrified of the fire he knew was between them. But he could not stay away. He became her shadow. He quit the bunkhouse at the Croft Ranch, instead paying the livery owner a few bits to sleep in the hayloft, where he could watch the boarding house. He would walk her the few hundred feet from the kitchen door to the stable when her work was done, the space between them charged with unspoken words. He was a sentinel, his presence a silent promise of protection. But it was a promise that terrified him. Protecting people was how his life had been ruined. The sight of Clara, her face pale with worry as she served meals to the rough men in the dining room, would sometimes trigger the memory, sharp and unwelcome as a shard of glass under the skin. He had been 17, working at a forge in a dusty Texas town, shoeing horses for a man named Jedediah. Jedediah was a brute, with a temper as hot as the iron he hammered and a thirst that was never quenched. He had a daughter, Lily, a slip of a girl with corn silk hair and eyes that were always downcast, as if she were trying to make herself invisible. Eli saw the bruises on her arms, the way she flinched when her father's shadow fell across her. One sweltering afternoon, Jedediah had been drinking heavily. He sent Eli to the far pasture to fetch a lame horse. When Eli returned, hours later, he heard a sound from the small house behind the forge, a thin, terrified whimper. He found them in the main room. Jedediah had Lily backed into a corner, her dress torn at the shoulder, his sour breath on her face. He was telling her it was time she learned how to be a woman. The world had gone red for Eli. He did not think. He reacted. He grabbed a heavy iron mallet from the workbench. He yelled Jedediah's name. When the big man turned, his face a mask of drunken rage. Eli swung. He had only meant to stop him, to knock him away from the girl. But the blow had been too strong, his fear and fury too great. Jedediah had fallen and had not gotten up again. The law called it murder. They had not cared that he had been protecting a frightened girl from her own father. All they saw was a dead man and the boy holding the bloody mallet. They sent him to prison, and he had never learned what became of Lily. He carried the weight of that failure, the fear that his intervention had only left her more alone and vulnerable than before. Protecting Clara felt like tempting the same disastrous fate. He was poison, and he would only end up destroying her, too. One afternoon, Clara was mending one of his saddlebags. A seam had come loose, and she had taken it upon herself to fix it. A small, domestic act that felt both comforting and profoundly dangerous. As she worked the needle through the thick leather, her fingers brushed against the oilcloth-wrapped packet inside a pocket. The letter, she pulled it out, her heart beating a little faster. It was his one personal possession, the anchor of his private grief. Her fingers itched to open it, to understand the source of the sorrow in his eyes. It felt wrong that she had shared the bones of her past with him, and he remained a locked room. But as she looked at the worn packet, at the faded, unfamiliar script on the front, she knew she could not. This was his story to tell, his burden to share. To steal it would be a violation worse than any rumor spread about her. She pushed the letter back deep into the pocket and finished her stitching, the unanswered questions a dull ache in her chest. That night, the tension in Broken Mesa was thick enough to taste. The Pinkerton had been asking more direct questions, mentioning the name Gable. Clara knew her time was running out. After her work was done, she met Eli by the creek bed that ran behind the town, a sliver of wilderness in the heart of corruption. The moon was a sliver in the sky, and the cottonwoods whispered secrets to the wind. "He knows," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The man at the boarding house. He knows my name." Eli's jaw was tight. "I told you we should have left." "And I told you I am done running," she shot back, her fear making her sharp. "This is my life, Eli. Not just a scandal to be outrun. It is my name, my reputation. What was done to me was wrong." He turned to her, his face a mess of conflict in the dim light. "Right and wrong do not matter out here. All that matters is living to see the next sunrise. And you will not. If you stay here, you need to leave. Tonight." He paused, and the words he spoke next felt like they were torn from him. "Without me." "Without you?" The words were a blow, knocking the air from her lungs. "Why?" "Because I am the reason you are still here," he said, his voice ragged. "Because I bring trouble. I have a darkness in me. Clara, it follows me. It will swallow you, too." She stared at him, at this man who saw himself as a curse, and she felt a sudden, fierce need to make him see the truth. Not just her truth, but his. "You want to know why I will not run?" she asked, her voice trembling with a sudden, raw intensity. "Because I have nothing left to lose that has not already been taken from me. Do you even know what they say about me? What they took?" And then it all came pouring out. Not just the story of the wedding, but all of it. The whole sordid, humiliating truth. She told him about her father, a man more concerned with the acreage of his land than the soul of his daughter, and how he had bartered her to Horace Gable to settle a boundary dispute and quiet the gossip. She told him about her first fiancé, James, a man whose love was a possessive, fragile thing. She told him about the afternoon James had found her crying by the river, mourning the recent death of a childhood friend, a boy she had once imagined a foolish, youthful future with. "He did not ask why I was crying," Clara whispered, the memory still burning with shame. "He simply assumed the worst, that I was unfaithful, that I was tainted. He could not stand the thought that I had ever cared for anyone but him. So he broke our engagement and he started the rumors himself. He told his friends I had a lover, that I was impure, and in a town where a woman's worth is measured by her virtue. It was enough to ruin me completely. My father believed him. Everyone did. It was easier than believing me." She was shaking now, the tears she had held back for so long finally breaking free. "So you see," she sobbed, wrapping her arms around herself, "I am not the runaway bride in some romantic tale. I am damaged goods, a spoiled horse sold to the highest bidder. That is what they made me." She crumpled then, her strength giving out, but before she hit the ground, Eli was there. He caught her, pulling her against his chest, his arms wrapping around her with a fierce, protective strength. He just held her, letting her weep, his hand stroking her hair, his body a solid anchor in her storm of grief. "Shh," he murmured against her hair. "You listen to me? You are not broken? You are not damaged?" He pulled back just enough to look her in the eyes, his own gaze burning with an intensity she had never seen before. "They lied, all of them." And in his eyes, she saw not pity, but a profound and searing understanding. He knew what it was to be judged, to be branded by a world that did not care about the truth. Seeing her own pain reflected in his eyes was her undoing. She surged forward, her mouth finding his. This was not like the desperate, frantic kiss in the stable. This was a kiss of utter, shattering surrender. It was a plea, a demand, a recognition of the shared wounds that bound them together. He responded instantly, his mouth claiming hers, his hands tangling in her hair, pulling her impossibly closer. The kiss was full of a desperate, aching need, a hunger to erase the loneliness that had defined both their lives. He broke the kiss, his forehead resting against hers, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Clara," he whispered, her name a prayer and a warning. "Take me somewhere," she breathed, her voice raw. "Somewhere they cannot see us." He did not hesitate. He took her hand, his grip firm and sure, and led her away from the creek, away from the sleeping, judgmental town, to the livery stable at the edge of the mesa. He led her up the rickety ladder to the hayloft. Moonlight streamed through the open loft door, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and painting a silver path across the floor. Through that opening, they could see the vast, dark expanse of the canyon, a sheer drop into nothingness. The world fell away at their feet. In the quiet, rustling hay, they came together. It was not gentle. There was no room for gentleness in the desperation that consumed them. It was a collision of ache and urgency, of need and solace. His hands traced the lines of her body, learning her, memorizing her, as if he were a blind man trying to read the last page of a precious book. She clung to him, her nails digging into the hard muscle of his back, anchoring herself to the only solid thing in her crumbling world. This was not about love, not the kind spoken of in poems. It was about survival. It was a raw, physical act of defiance against a world that had tried to erase them. It was two lonely souls making a claim, staking out a small piece of territory in the darkness. Afterward, they lay tangled in the hay, their bodies slick with sweat, the cool night air washing over them. Clara lay with her head on his chest, listening to the steady, slowing beat of his heart. She felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost painful. For the first time since she had fled the chapel, she did not feel like she was falling. She lifted her head and looked at him. His eyes were open, staring at the rafters, his face grim in the moonlight. The sorrow was already returning, chasing away the brief, fierce light that had been between them. "I never want to fall alone again," she whispered, the words a confession of her deepest fear. He flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of the muscle beneath her ear. He turned his head and looked at her, and the pain in his eyes was so stark, so naked, that it stole her breath. He did not say a word. He just looked at her, and in his silence, she felt him pulling away, retreating back into the prison of his past. He believed he was the canyon's edge, that to hold on to him was to be pulled over into the abyss. He left before the sun rose. She had drifted into a light, exhausted sleep, and when she awoke, the space beside her was cold. A sudden, sharp panic seized her. She sat up, her heart pounding. He was gone. His boots, his hat, his gun belt, all gone. It was as if he had never been there at all. Then she saw it, lying on a pile of hay where his head had been. It was a small, torn piece of paper, ripped from the edge of a letter. The paper was worn and soft. The ink faded. There were only 2 words written on it, in a script that was not his. "Forgive me." The cold in the hayloft was a different kind than the desert's night chill. It was the cold of absence, a hollow space where the warmth of another body had been. Clara sat up, clutching the rough wool of Eli's blanket, and the torn piece of paper felt impossibly heavy in her hand. "Forgive me." The words were a plea, but also a final, damning judgment. He was apologizing for what they had done, for the brief, desperate fire they had lit against the darkness. He saw it as a mistake, a weakness. He saw himself as a contamination she needed to be saved from. The devastation was a physical blow, a pressure in her chest that made it hard to breathe. He had not just left her, he had confirmed her deepest fear, that she was not worth staying for. But as the initial shock gave way to a cold, rising anger, another thought took hold. The words were not his handwriting. This was a piece of his past, a piece of the story he kept locked away in that worn letter. "Forgive me." It was an apology for something else entirely. He had not left her because of what they had shared. He had left because he believed he had to confront whatever haunted him, alone. He had gone to cut the final thread to his past, foolishly thinking it would set her free. He did not understand. She was already tied to him, not by a thread, but by a rope. She dressed with a frantic energy, her mind racing. He could not have gone far. She scrambled down the ladder from the loft, her movements clumsy in the pre-dawn gloom. The livery was quiet, smelling of horse and old leather. A young boy, no older than 15, was mucking out a stall, his movements slow and rhythmic. "The man who sleeps here," Clara said, her voice more breathless than she intended. "The one they call Eli. Did you see him leave?" The boy, whose name was Sam, leaned on his pitchfork and eyed her warily. He had seen the way the quiet horsebreaker watched this woman from the boarding house. "Rode out an hour ago, before first light." "Which way?" Sam shrugged, turning back to his work. "Ain't my business." Clara's hands fumbled in the small pocket of her dress. She pulled out the few coins she had managed to save from her kitchen work. It was not much, barely enough for a decent meal, but it was everything she had. She held it out on her palm. "Please, it is important." The boy's eyes lit on the coins. Loyalty was cheap in Broken Mesa. "He rode north," he said, his voice a low conspiracy. "Toward the ridges. Folks say he was heading for the old Jedediah place. Ain't nothing out there now but Jedediah's brother, Caleb. And Caleb's meaner than a cornered snake. Hates strangers." He looked at Clara, a flicker of concern in his young eyes. "Man who rides out there alone is either looking for work or looking for death." Clara's blood ran cold. The old Jedediah place, a confrontation. He had gone to face his ghosts. She pressed the coins into the boy's hand. "Is there a horse I can take? A gentle one?" "Mrs. Gable will have my hide." "She will never know." Clara insisted, her voice low and urgent. "I will have it back before she is even awake." For another coin, a small silver dollar she had kept hidden in the seam of her dress. Sam saddled a placid-looking mare. As he cinched the saddle, he looked at her torn dress and worn shoes. "You ain't dressed for that country, ma'am. It is rough riding." "I have to find him," she said, the words an unbreakable vow. She let the boy help her into the saddle, and without a backward glance, she kicked the mare into a trot, following the trail that led out of town and into the jagged, broken country to the north. The ride was an agony. The sun climbed, beating down on her head. The landscape was a treacherous maze of rock and thorny scrub. She was not a natural rider, and the unfamiliar saddle rubbed her legs raw. Thirst became a living thing, a rasp in her throat. But she pushed on, her focus narrowed to a single, desperate purpose. Find him. In the late afternoon, as she was navigating a narrow trail along the side of a ridge, the mare suddenly shied, spooked by a lizard that darted across their path. The horse reared, and the ground beneath its hooves, baked dry and brittle, crumbled away. Clara screamed as the world tilted sideways. She lost her stirrups, her hands slipping on the reins. For one terrifying moment, she was looking down into the sheer, rocky depths of a dry ravine. Death was a breath away. She threw her weight back, clinging to the mare's mane with all her strength, her feet scrambling for purchase. The horse found its footing on the solid edge of the trail, its sides heaving, its eyes wide with terror. Clara slumped forward against the horse's neck, her body trembling uncontrollably. She was alive. The nearness of death did not frighten her as much as it clarified things. The rumors, the shame, her father's betrayal, they were all meaningless out here. The only thing that mattered was the steady beat of her own heart, and the thought of Eli, alone and facing a danger she could not name. She straightened up, her resolve hardening into something unbreakable, and urged the weary mare forward. At that very moment, Eli was riding into a trap. He had approached the Jedediah ranch with caution, his hand resting near his gun. He did not want a fight. He wanted an ending. He had come to face Caleb, to tell him the truth of what had happened with his brother, and to offer himself up. He would take whatever justice Caleb saw fit to dispense, as long as it ended here, as long as the shadow of his past never touched Clara again. But as he rode into the dusty ranch yard, he saw them waiting for him on the porch. Sheriff Miller was there, his beefy frame overflowing a creaking wooden chair. And with him were two other men. One was the quiet Pinkerton from town, The other was a portly, well-dressed man with a neatly trimmed gray beard and a look of cold, proprietary fury on his face, a man Eli had never seen before. "That is him," the well-dressed man said, his voice a low growl of satisfaction. Sheriff Miller heaved himself to his feet. "Eli Cole," he boomed, though the name was a question. "You are under arrest." Eli's hand froze above his pistol. This was wrong. "Arrest for what?" "For the assault of one of my men, for a start," a new voice said. Silas Croft stepped out of the ranch house, a smug look on his face. He had clearly been a part of this arrangement. "That is not why you are here," Eli said, his eyes on the sheriff. This was more than a trumped-up charge over a saloon brawl. The well-dressed man stepped forward, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "You are under arrest for abducting my betrothed, Miss Clara Mae Thompson." "Clara!" The name hit Eli like a physical blow. He stared at the man, the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. This was him, Horace Gable, the man she had fled. He had found them. This was not about Eli's past at all. It was about hers. He had not led trouble away from her. He had led her directly into its path. Before he could react, two of Croft's men stepped out from behind the bunkhouse, rifles leveled. There was nowhere to run. They pulled him from his horse, bound his hands behind his back with a rough rope, and shoved him toward the main house. His world had narrowed to a single, agonizing thought. He had failed her completely. Clara saw it all from a ridge overlooking the ranch. She had arrived just in time to see them drag Eli, struggling, into the house. His face was already bruised, a dark welt forming under one eye. Her heart seized in her chest. She was too late. Her desperate ride, her reckless hope. It had all been for nothing. She had found him only to watch him be swallowed by the very danger she had sought to share. Panic and instinct warred within her. She could ride away, save herself. No one knew she was here, but the image of his bruised face, of the weary resignation in his posture as they shoved him through the door, was burned into her mind. She could not leave him. Not again. She slid off the mare, tethering it loosely in a thicket of scrub oak where it would not be seen from the yard. She had no plan, only a frantic, desperate need to do something. She crept down the rocky slope, using the boulders and brush for cover, her mind racing. She had to get him out, but how? She was so focused on the main house that she did not see the man until he was almost upon her. He was one of Croft's riders, circling the perimeter of the property. He grabbed her arm, his grip like a vice. "Well now," he said, a slow, ugly grin spreading across his face. "Look what we have here, a little lost dove." Clara screamed and fought, kicking and scratching, but he was too strong. He dragged her, stumbling, down the hill and into the ranch yard, shouting for the others. The front door of the house flew open. Horace Gable stepped out, followed by the Pinkerton. Gable's face, when he saw her, was a terrifying mask of triumph and rage. "Clara," he said, the name a possessive hiss. "So you came for your stable boy lover. How touching, and how foolish." He walked toward her, his eyes raking over her torn, dirty dress with disgust. "Did you really think you could escape me? I own this territory. I own the law here, and I own you." His words confirmed her worst fears. She had not run to freedom. She had run into a larger, more brutal cage. Croft's man shoved her forward, and she stumbled to her knees in the dust at Gable's feet. Her presence, her desperate attempt to save Eli, had done nothing but expose her and seal both their fates. "Put her in the cellar," Gable commanded, his voice cold and devoid of any emotion. "She can wait there. We have business to finish with her protector." They dragged her into the house and down a short flight of rickety wooden steps into a small, dark cellar. The air was cool and damp, smelling of earth and spoiled preserves. They threw her inside and slammed the heavy wooden door, the sound of a thick iron bar sliding into place echoing in the darkness. She was a prisoner. For a long time, she sat in the absolute blackness, shaking. Then, from the floor above, the sounds began. The thud of a fist hitting flesh, a man's grunt of pain, Eli's. The sound was followed by the low, cruel laughter of other men. Then another blow, and another. They were beating him. A raw, primal scream tore from Clara's throat. She scrambled to her feet, her hands flying to the door, pounding on the thick wood until her fists were raw. "Stop it!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "Leave him alone, please!" Her only answer was another sickening thud from above, and Gable's voice, raised in anger. "Where were you taking her, boy? Did you think you could have what belongs to me?" Clara clawed at the door, her nails splintering against the wood. She felt the rough stone walls of her prison, searching for any weakness, any crack, any hope of escape. There was none. She was trapped, forced to be an auditory witness to the brutal punishment of the man she had come to save. With every blow he suffered, a piece of her own heart shattered. She slumped to the dirt floor, her body racked with helpless, silent sobs. The sounds from above a relentless, brutal torture. The beating seemed to go on for an eternity. Then, finally, there was silence. A silence that was somehow more terrifying than the noise. Was he dead? The thought was a cold stone in her stomach. Sometime later, a new sound began, shouting from outside, distant at first, then closer. There was a frantic, panicked edge to the voices. And then she smelled it, a faint, acrid scent at first, then thicker, unmistakable, smoke. The shouting grew louder, a chaos of voices yelling, "The barn! It is the barn! The whole thing is going up!" The sounds of running feet pounded on the floor above her. The house seemed to empty out as every man on the ranch ran to fight the fire. In the confusion, Clara heard the iron bar on her cellar door rattle, as if someone had bumped against it in their haste. Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through her. She threw her shoulder against the door. It held fast. She did it again and again, putting all of her weight, all of her fear and fury, into the effort. On the fourth try, with a screech of tortured metal, the bar, which had been knocked partially free of its bracket, gave way, and the door swung inward. She stumbled up the stairs into the empty house. Through the windows, she could see a hellish orange glow. The entire barn was engulfed in flames, a roaring inferno against the night sky. The ranch was in chaos. Men were yelling, leading panicked horses from the corrals, throwing useless buckets of water at the blaze. She found Eli in a small room off the main hall. He was slumped in a chair, his hands still bound, his head bowed. A single guard stood over him, but his attention was fixed on the spectacle of the fire outside the window. Clara did not hesitate. She grabbed a heavy iron poker from the fireplace, moving silently on her bare feet. She crept up behind the guard. With a strangled cry, she swung the poker with all her might, hitting him squarely in the back of the head. He crumpled to the floor without a sound. She rushed to Eli, her hands fumbling with the knots of the rope around his wrists. "Eli," she whispered, her voice choked. "Eli, can you hear me?" He lifted his head slowly. His face was a swollen, bloody mess. One eye was closed completely, and his lip was split, but he was alive. He looked at her, and in his one good eye, she saw a flicker of disbelief, of wonder. "Clara," he rasped, his voice raw. She freed his hands and helped him to his feet. He swayed, his body a dead weight against her. He could barely walk. "We have to go," she urged, her arm around his waist, taking his weight. "Now, while they are distracted." She half dragged, half carried him out the back door and into the chaos of the yard. No one paid them any mind, their attention consumed by the roaring fire. She found the mare where she had left it on the ridge. Getting Eli into the saddle was a monumental struggle, but somehow they managed it. She took the reins, leading the horse away from the ranch, away from the fire and the shouting, and back into the cool, silent darkness of the desert. They traveled for hours, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the ranch. Finally, when Eli could go no further, she found a sheltered spot in a small arroyo. She helped him down from the horse and built a small fire. In the flickering light, she tended to his wounds, gently cleaning the blood from his face with a strip of cloth torn from her dress. He sat silently, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking, and then he began to weep. Not loudly, but with the deep, silent, ragged sobs of a man utterly broken. "It is my fault," he choked out, the words thick with shame. "I brought you here. I tried to protect you, and I dragged you right into his hands. I am sorry, Clara. I am so sorry." Clara knelt in front of him. She took his battered face in her hands, her thumbs gently stroking his bruised cheeks. She looked into his one good eye, which was swimming with tears, and her own heart ached with a love so fierce it felt like it might break her. She leaned forward and kissed his split lip, a touch as soft as a prayer. She kissed the swollen purple skin of his closed eye. She kissed the jagged cut on his forehead. "You have nothing to be sorry for," she whispered, her forehead resting against his. "You did not make me fall. Eli, you never did." She pulled back, her eyes holding his. "You are the one who helped me stand." He stared at her, the shame in his eyes slowly being replaced by a dawning wonder. He reached out a trembling hand and touched her face, as if to be sure she was real. They stayed like that for a long moment, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the vast, empty silence of the desert night. Later, as they lay huddled together under a single blanket, the mournful howl of a coyote echoed from the distant canyon walls. The fire cast long, dancing shadows that flickered and swayed like ghosts. Clara lay with her head on Eli's chest, her arm thrown across him possessively. He was broken and beaten, and they were fugitives with nothing but a tired horse and the clothes on their backs. But as she listened to the slow, steady beat of his heart beneath her ear, she felt, for the first time in her life, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. They were two broken pieces, but here, in the darkness, they fit together perfectly. The first light of dawn found them in the arroyo, the world painted in soft shades of gray and rose. Eli was awake, his back propped against the rock wall, his face a roadmap of pain and exhaustion. Clara had cleaned his wounds as best she could, but the swelling and bruises were stark in the morning light. She stirred the small fire, her movements quiet, her mind a turmoil of fear and a strange, fierce new hope. The fire she had seen in the barn had ignited something in her, too, a defiant anger that burned away the last of her fear. "We need to go." Eli's voice was a low rasp, thick with pain. "Before they find us." Clara looked up. "Where would we go?" "East," he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if he could will a new life into existence there. "Back toward settled country. I can get you to a real city, a place where you can disappear, find work, be safe." "Be safe," the words hung in the cool air. He meant safe from Gable, from the law, from the brutal realities of this land. But she knew he also meant safe from him. He was still trying to push her away, to save her from the wreckage he believed he was. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. He turned his head, his one good eye fixing on her with pained disbelief. "Clara, you saw what they did. What he is. He will not stop. He will send men. He will hunt you down like an animal." "And we will spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders?" she countered. Setting aside the stick she had been using to tend the fire, she moved to kneel in front of him. "Is that living, Eli, or is it just a slower way to die? I have been hiding my whole life, hiding from whispers, from shame, from the life my father planned for me. I hid in that kitchen in Broken Mesa. I am done hiding." "This is not about shame," he argued, his voice rising with a desperate frustration. "This is about staying alive. I got you into this. It is my duty to get you out." "Your duty?" She shook her head, a sad smile touching her lips. "You did not get me into this. My father did, James did, Horace Gable did. You were just the first person who saw me as a person, and not a problem to be solved or a property to be owned. Do not take that away from me now by treating me like a package to be delivered to safety." She took his hand, her fingers tracing the raw, scraped knuckles. "I want to go back to Broken Mesa." He looked at her as if she had lost her mind. "They will arrest us, or worse." "Let them try," she said, and the fire in her eyes was a reflection of the one that had consumed the barn. They built their power on lies and fear. It is time someone told the truth, in front of everyone. I will not let Horace Gable own my story. I will not let him chase me across the country. My life begins when I stop running from him. Here, now. He stared at her, at the fierce, unyielding strength in her face. This was not the terrified girl in the torn wedding dress he had found by the trail. This was a woman forged in the fires of betrayal and injustice, and she was no longer brittle. She was steel. He saw his own long-suppressed desire for justice mirrored in her eyes. He had spent years running from his own past, accepting its judgment. Her courage was a challenge to his own weary resignation. "It is a fool's errand," he whispered, but the protest was weak. "Then we will be fools together," she said. The ride back to Broken Mesa was slow and painful. Eli swayed in the saddle, his body protesting every jolt. Clara rode behind him, her arms around his waist, offering what little support she could. They were a grim spectacle, returning to the very place they should have been fleeing, and their arrival did not go unnoticed. The town was buzzing. The fire at the Croft Jedediah Ranch was the only thing on anyone's lips. The story had already twisted and turned into a dozen different legends. Some said the horsebreaker, Eli, had said it himself, a mad act of revenge against Silas Croft. They looked at him with fear and suspicion as he and Clara rode down the main street. Others, the small ranchers and homesteaders who had been squeezed by Croft for years, whispered a different version. They said the runaway bride had started it, a fiery act of defiance. They looked at Clara with a kind of awed respect. No one knew the truth, but everyone had an opinion. They were not just a man and a woman anymore. They were a symbol of either chaos or rebellion, depending on who you asked. Clara took Eli to the livery stable. Sam, the stable boy, saw them, and his eyes went wide. He rushed forward, taking the reins of their tired horse without a word, his expression a mixture of fear and admiration. He helped Eli dismount and led him to a fresh pile of hay in an empty stall. "I will get you some water," he said, and scurried off. A boy caught in a drama far bigger than he was. Clara knew they had little time. Gable would not be far behind. She left Eli resting in the stable and walked out into the main street, her steps sure and deliberate. She was heading for the saloon. It was the heart of the town, the place where opinions were formed and fates were decided. If she was going to tell her story, she would do it there. She pushed through the swinging doors. The saloon went silent. The tinny piano stopped mid-note. Every man in the room, cowboys, prospectors, merchants, turned to stare. A lone woman in a saloon was an anomaly, a woman who looked as she did, in a filthy, torn dress. Her face smudged with soot and streaked with tears, was a cataclysm. And then she saw him. Horace Gable was sitting at a table in the back with Sheriff Miller and the Pinkerton man. He had a glass of whiskey in his hand, and his face was a mask of smug satisfaction. He thought he had won. He believed she had fled into the desert to die. His smile vanished when he saw her, a flicker of disbelief. Then a surge of pure, undiluted rage. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly on the wooden floor. "Clara," he said, his voice dangerously low, meant for her ears alone. But in the dead silence of the room, everyone heard it. "You are making a spectacle of yourself. Come with me now, and we can forget this foolishness." He started toward her, his hand outstretched, as if to claim his property. Clara stood her ground. Just as he reached her, the saloon doors swung open again, Eli stood there, leaning heavily against the doorframe, his face a swollen wreck. He said nothing, but his presence was a statement. He was with her. Clara ignored Gable's outstretched hand. She turned her back on him and faced the room of silent, watching men. She pitched her voice so that every person in that smoky, whiskey-soaked room could hear her. "My name is Clara Mae Thompson," she began, her voice clear and steady, betraying none of the terror she felt. "And that man," she pointed a trembling finger at Gable, "is not my fiancé. He is the man who bought me from my father." A low murmur went through the crowd. Gable's face turned a mottled shade of red. "That is enough. Clara, you are hysterical." "I am not hysterical," she shot back, her voice rising. "I am telling the truth, something this town has not heard in a long time. You all whisper about the runaway bride. You think you know the story. Let me tell you what really happened." And she did. She told them everything. She told them of her first engagement to a man named James, a man whose pride was so fragile that he could not bear the sight of her tears for a dead friend. "He did not want a wife," she said, her voice ringing with scorn. "He wanted a possession that had never belonged to anyone else. And when he decided I was flawed, he discarded me and soiled my name to protect his own vanity." She then turned her gaze fully on Gable. "And then he came, Mr. Horace Gable. He did not care about the rumors. Why would he, when you are buying livestock? You do not care what the other cattle think. He made a deal with my father. Land for a daughter. A respectable solution to a shameful problem. I was to be his wife, to seal a business deal and be hidden away on his ranch where my ruined reputation could not tarnish him." Gable took another step toward her. "This is a private family matter." "Was it a family matter when you hired that Pinkerton to hunt me down?" Clara's voice was like a whip crack. "Was it a family matter when you paid Sheriff Miller to arrest this man?" She gestured to Eli. "On false charges, and then had your men beat him half to death in your house? This man did nothing but offer me water when I was dying of thirst. He protected me, and for that, you tried to kill him." The crowd was utterly still, their eyes shifting from Clara's impassioned face to Gable's sputtering rage and the sheriff's suddenly sweaty brow. She was not just telling her story, she was telling theirs. She was speaking of the casual cruelty of powerful men, of a justice that was for sale, of the helplessness they all felt in the face of money and guns. "This man," she said, her voice dropping but losing none of its intensity, "did not come to Broken Mesa to claim a bride. He came to collect his property. And I am not his property. I am not anyone's. I am a free woman, and I will not be silenced by his lies, or his money, or his men." She finished, her chest heaving, her whole body trembling with the force of her own words. The silence that followed was profound. Then, from the back of the room, a grizzled old prospector slowly, deliberately, put his glass down on the bar. It was a small sound, but it was a judgment. The spell of Gable's power was broken. He was no longer a respected baron. He was just a bully, exposed. That evening, in the quiet hayloft of the livery, the air was different. The tension had been lanced. Eli sat with his back against a post, watching as Clara stitched a tear in her dress with a needle and thread borrowed from Sam. She had faced down her dragon, and a quiet, profound peace had settled over her. Eli reached into his saddlebag and pulled out the oilcloth-wrapped letter. He had watched her in the saloon, had seen her claim her own truth with a courage that humbled him. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he could no longer hide behind his own. "I want to read you something," he said, his voice quiet. Clara looked up, her needle pausing mid-stitch. He unwrapped the letter, his battered fingers gentle on the worn paper. He took a deep, shaky breath and began to read. "Dear Eli," he read, his voice thick with emotion. "It has taken me a long time to find the words to write this, and longer still to find a man I trusted to try and get it to you. My name is Lily. You may not remember me, but I remember you." Clara's breath caught in her throat. Lily, the girl from the forge. I know they put you away for what happened to my father. Eli continued reading, his voice cracking. I know they said you murdered him, but I know the truth. You saved me. That day, when you stopped him, you gave me a chance to live. I ran away that night. I was afraid, but I was free. I made my way to St. Louis. I found work, and I met a good man, a carpenter named Thomas. We have been married for 2 years. We have a baby girl. We call her Hope. Eli had to stop, his throat closing. Tears were streaming freely down his bruised cheeks. Clara moved to his side, her hand resting on his arm. He took another shuddering breath and continued. I never knew if you were alive or dead, but I never stopped thinking about you. I want you to know that I am safe. I am happy, and I forgive you. There is nothing to forgive. You are the only person who was ever brave enough to stand up for me. I pray that wherever you are, you can find it in your heart to forgive yourself. You are a good man. Eli Cole. Do not let anyone, especially yourself, tell you otherwise. Your friend, Lily. He finished, the letter trembling in his hands. He buried his face in his hands and wept, the deep, soul-shaking sobs of a man releasing a guilt he had carried like a shroud for years. He had thought his act of violence had only created more tragedy. He had believed himself a destroyer. But all this time, a seed of hope he had planted had been growing in a life he had saved. He was not a murderer. He was a protector. Clara wrapped her arms around him, holding him tight, her own tears mingling with his. The final wall around his heart crumbled, and in the quiet of the hayloft, 2 broken people began, finally, to heal. The next morning, Sheriff Miller, his face a grim mask of duty under pressure from a humiliated and furious Gable, came for them. He found them in the main street, ready to leave. Clara Thompson, he said, trying to sound official. I have a warrant for your arrest, for the theft of a horse from the livery stable. Before Clara or Eli could react, a new voice cut through the morning air. She did not steal it. I lent it to her. It was Sam, the stable boy, standing tall, his face pale but determined. And if she had not taken it, she would be dead, another voice added. It was Martha, a stern-faced widow who ran the small bakery. She stepped forward, her arms crossed over her chest. My own daughter was not so lucky when a man like Gable decided he owned her. We will not let it happen again. Not in this town. Then the blacksmith stepped out from his forge, a heavy hammer in his hand. The owner of the general store came to stand on his porch. Even Mrs. Gable, the boarding house owner, stood on her steps, her face an unreadable mask. But she did not move to help the sheriff. The people of Broken Mesa, the quiet, fearful people, were forming a silent, unmoving wall. They had seen the truth, and they were choosing a side. Sheriff Miller looked at the line of stubborn, silent faces. He was a bully, but he was no fool. He looked at Gable, who stood by his horse, his face a thundercloud of impotent rage. The lawman's authority, bought and paid for, had evaporated in the clear light of day. He slowly, reluctantly, lowered his hand from his gun. Get out of my town, he muttered, not to them, but to the idea of them. Just go. As the sun climbed over the distant mountains, Clara and Eli rode out of Broken Mesa. They were not running. They were leaving. Behind them, they left a town that had been changed, a town that had found its voice. Ahead of them, the land opened up, vast and full of promise. They followed a trail that led along the high rim of the canyon. The storms had passed, and in the crevices of the rocks, impossible splashes of color had appeared. The bright yellow of desert marigolds, the deep purple of verbena. Life, tenacious and beautiful, was blooming in the harshest of places. We could find a place, Clara said, her voice soft, full of a hope she had not dared to feel before. A small piece of land, No one would know us. We could build a house." Eli looked at her, his battered face softening. He reached out and took her hand. "A small house," he agreed, a real smile touching his lips for the first time. "With a porch and a garden for your wildflowers." It was in that moment of peace, that shared dream of a quiet future, that the world exploded. The crack of a rifle shot echoed from the rocks above them, sharp and deafening. A bullet whined past Clara's ear, kicking up a spray of dirt from the trail just ahead. They were being ambushed. "Get down!" Eli yelled, shoving her from the horse. He dove for cover behind a cluster of boulders as another shot rang out, striking the rock where his head had been a second before. Clara scrambled behind the rocks with him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She peered over the edge. 3 men, their faces masked by bandanas, were positioned in the rocks 100 yards up the trail, rifles leveled. Gable's final, cowardly act of vengeance. Eli drew his pistol, firing back to keep their heads down, but they were outgunned and pinned down. "I cannot get a clear shot," he grunted, as a bullet ricocheted dangerously close. He looked at her, his face grim. His rifle was still in its scabbard on the horse, which had bolted a short distance down the trail. "Clara, I need you to listen to me. When I give the signal, you run for the horse. Get the rifle." "No," she cried. "I will not leave you." "You are not leaving me. You are helping me," he insisted, his voice hard with urgency. He fired 2 more shots. "Go, now!" He laid down a volley of covering fire. Clara did not think. She ran. The world seemed to slow down, the air thick and heavy. She could hear the bullets whining past her, the shouts of the men above. She reached the panicked horse, her hands fumbling with the leather straps of the scabbard. She pulled the rifle free. It was heavy, impossibly so, the wood smooth and cool in her trembling hands. She turned back. One of the bandits had broken cover, trying to get a better angle on Eli. He was exposed, his back to her. Eli was reloading, his pistol useless for a critical second. It was her or it was Eli. Her mind went quiet. The trembling in her hands did not stop, but a strange, cold calm settled over her. She lifted the heavy rifle to her shoulder, just as Eli had shown her once on the trail, for hunting rabbits. She braced the stock against her cheek. She lined up the sights on the man's back. She closed her eyes for a split second, a prayer on her lips, and pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed the rifle butt into her shoulder. A brutal, shocking force. The sound was a deafening roar in her ears. When she opened her eyes, the man was gone. He was no longer standing. He was a heap on the rocky ground. The other 2 bandits, shocked, fired one last wild shot before scrambling from their hiding place and disappearing over the ridge. Silence descended, broken only by the ringing in her ears and the frantic, ragged sound of her own breathing. She stood alone on the canyon trail, the heavy rifle still in her hands, the metallic scent of gunpowder sharp in the clean desert air. She had done it. The terrified bride who had fled a chapel had just saved them both. The silence that crashed down after the last shot was heavier than any sound. It pressed in on Clara, a physical weight filling her ears, which still rang with the deafening roar of the rifle. The heavy weapon slid from her numb fingers, clattering onto the rocky ground. She stared at the spot where the bandit had been. Now a crumpled heap of cloth and stillness. The other men were gone, vanished back into the uncaring rocks. She was alone. No, not alone. Her head snapped toward the boulders where Eli had taken cover. He was not there. He was lying on the trail, sprawled in the dust a few feet from his position. He was not moving. A sound, a thin, ragged whimper, escaped her lips. "Eli." The name was a ghost in the vast emptiness. She stumbled toward him, her legs feeling like they were made of lead and straw. The world was a blur of sun-bleached rock and terrifyingly blue sky. She fell to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over his body. afraid to touch, afraid of what she might find. "Eli, please," she whispered, her voice breaking. There was a dark, wet stain spreading across the shoulder of his shirt. Blood, so much blood. His face was pale as ash beneath the bruises, his eyes closed. For one terrible, eternal moment, she believed he was gone. The strength that had carried her through the saloon, through the fire, through the ambush, shattered into a million pieces. The canyon, which had begun to look like a place of promise, was once again a gaping maw, an abyss ready to swallow her whole. She had been so determined not to fall alone, and here she was, about to be left in the most profound loneliness of all. Then he stirred. A low groan rumbled in his chest, and his eyelids fluttered. His one good eye opened, struggling to focus on her face. Relief so powerful it was like a physical blow slammed into her, driving the air from her lungs in a sob. He was alive. He was alive. "You are a terrible shot," he rasped, a ghost of a smile touching his battered lips before it twisted into a wince of pain. Tears she had not realized she was holding back streamed down her face, splashing onto the dusty fabric of his shirt. "I was not aiming for you." "I know," he whispered. He tried to push himself up, but his arm gave out and he collapsed back with a sharp intake of breath. The bullet had torn through the thick muscle of his shoulder. It was a serious wound, but it had not killed him. She helped him sit up, tearing a long strip from the hem of her already ruined dress to press against the wound, to stanch the bleeding. He leaned heavily against her, his head resting on her shoulder, his breathing shallow and labored. They were a tableau of ruin and survival, clinging to each other at the very edge of the world. The sheer drop of the canyon was just a few feet away, a constant reminder of how close they were to the brink. She could feel the tremors of pain that racked his body. She held him tighter, as if she could absorb his suffering into herself. The raw, terrifying fear of the last few minutes coalesced into a single, desperate plea. She pressed her face into the curve of his neck, her voice a raw whisper against his skin. "Don't let me fall alone." He shifted, his good arm coming up to wrap around her, pulling her even closer. He pressed his forehead against hers, the touch a brand of heat and solace. His eye, the one that could see, held her gaze, and in its depths, she saw not the haunted fugitive, not the broken man, but a promise, a foundation. "Not ever again," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. They stayed like that for a long time, drawing strength from each other. Two solitary figures silhouetted against the vast, empty sky. But the sun was beginning to dip, and the realities of their situation could not be ignored. There was a dead man on the trail, and Eli was losing blood. With a grim, shared resolve, they dealt with the grim necessity. They dragged the body of the bandit off the trail and into a shallow crevice, covering it with a cairn of heavy rocks. It was a crude burial, anonymous and bleak. There were no prayers said. It was simply the closing of a violent chapter, a task to be done before they could move on. The journey from the canyon rim was a nightmare. Clara managed to get Eli onto the horse, but he could not stay upright on his own. She walked beside him, her body pressed against his leg, her arm holding him steady in the saddle, while her other hand held the reins. Every step was an agony for him, every jostle of the horse sending fresh waves of pain through his shoulder. They followed the path downward, away from the high, dangerous cliffs and toward the life-giving ribbon of a river they could see shimmering in the valley below. Just as darkness was falling, when Clara thought neither she nor Eli could take another step, they saw a light, a single, welcoming lantern hanging from a post. It was a small, ramshackle outpost, little more than a sod-roofed cabin and a corral, nestled in a grove of cottonwoods by the river. Hope, something she was beginning to recognize, surged in her chest. An older couple emerged as they approached, drawn by the weary tread of their horse. The man, Abel, was tall and stooped, with kind, watery eyes. His wife, Sarah, was a small, stout woman with hands that were gnarled from work but moved with a gentle efficiency. They took one look at Eli's pale face and bloody shirt, at Clara's exhausted, desperate expression, and asked no questions. They helped her get Eli inside and onto a simple cot, while Abel tended to the horse. Sarah set about caring for Eli with a practiced calm. She had seen wounds like this before. She cleaned it, her touch firm but gentle, and packed it with a poultice of herbs that smelled of sage and yarrow. Eli, delirious with pain and exhaustion, barely stirred. For 3 days, he drifted in and out of a fevered sleep. Clara never left his side. She sat in a small wooden chair, watching the rise and fall of his chest, bathing his face with cool water, and murmuring to him when he cried out in his sleep. Sarah would bring her broth and bread, forcing her to eat, her presence a silent, maternal comfort in the quiet of that small cabin, tended by the simple kindness of strangers. Clara felt a profound sense of peace. The world of violence and fear, of Gable and the Pinkertons, seemed 1,000 miles away. On the 4th day, the fever broke. Eli woke, his eyes clear for the first time. He saw her sitting there, her face drawn with exhaustion but her eyes alight with relief. He reached out his good hand and she took it, her fingers lacing through his. No words were needed. While Eli slowly regained his strength, Clara took stock of their new life. They had nothing but the horse, his pistol and rifle, and the clothes on their backs. Her dress, the white wedding gown that had been her shroud and then her banner, was now a tattered, blood-stained ruin. It was a ghost of a life she no longer wanted. One morning, she took the bundle of cloth to Sarah. "I was wondering," she began, her voice hesitant, "if you might know someone who would trade for this. For the fabric, it is good lace." Sarah looked at the ruined dress, then at Clara's face. She understood. "I have a trunk," she said. "My daughter's things. She passed some years ago. She was about your size. It would do me good to see them worn." She led Clara to a small, cedar-lined trunk. Inside, folded neatly, were simple, practical clothes, a sturdy wool skirt, a pair of men's denim trousers, a soft cotton blouse. Clara chose the trousers and the blouse. She traded the symbol of her bondage for the uniform of her freedom. When she put them on, she felt like she was inhabiting her own skin for the first time. She was no longer Clara Thompson, the ruined bride. She was just Clara, a woman of the West. As the weeks passed, Eli grew stronger. He and Abel would talk for hours, their voices a low murmur on the cabin's porch. Abel told them about a small parcel of land, a few miles upriver, right at the base of the canyon cliffs. It was not much, he said, a bit rocky, but no one had claimed it and the river provided water. The day Eli was strong enough to ride, they knew it was time to leave. They thanked the old couple with a sincerity that went beyond words. Abel gave Eli a sturdy walking stick he had carved, and Sarah pressed a small sack of seeds into Clara's hand. "For a garden," she said, her eyes smiling. "Every home needs a garden." They found the parcel of land easily. It was just as Abel had described, a small, defensible meadow protected on one side by the river and on the other by the towering, sheer rock face of the canyon. It was beautiful and wild and felt, impossibly, like home. And so, they began to work. Their life fell into a rhythm of labor and shared purpose. They cleared stones from the meadow, with an axe borrowed from Abel. Eli began to fell cottonwood trees, his shoulders still aching but his resolve like iron. He taught Clara how to strip the bark, how to notch the logs. Together, day by day, they built a shelter. It was not much, just a single small room with a packed earth floor and a roof of sod. But it was theirs. They had built it with their own hands. While Eli worked on the cabin, Clara turned her attention to the soil. She found a patch of earth near the door, cleared it of rocks, and tilled it with a sharp-edged stone. with a care that was almost reverent. She planted the seeds Sarah had given her: corn, beans, and squash, and in a small, protected plot of her own. She planted the wildflower seeds she had gathered from the canyon rim, a promise of beauty in their rugged new world. In the evenings, they would sit by their small fire, their bodies aching with a satisfying weariness. Sometimes they would talk, sharing small stories of their youth, filling in the empty spaces of their pasts. Other times, they would sit in a comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge, their shoulders touching. The raw, desperate urgency that had first brought them together in the hayloft had deepened into something quieter, stronger. A steady and profound connection forged in shared hardship and mutual respect. One night, as Clara was banking the fire, she saw Eli working on something by the light of the flames. He was holding a small piece of cottonwood, turning it over and over, carefully carving it with his knife. She watched him, his face intent, the firelight catching the new, peaceful lines around his eyes. He was no longer a man haunted by ghosts. He was a man building a future. Their shelter was finished just as the seasons began to turn. The air grew cooler at night, and the wind that swept down from the high canyons had a new, sharper edge to it. One night, a real storm rolled in. Not of rain, but of wind. It howled around their small cabin, a wild, elemental force that seemed determined to tear their fragile home from its foundations. The walls rattled, and a fine dust sifted down from the sod roof. The wind shrieked like a banshee, a sound that would have once terrified Clara. But inside, she was not afraid. Eli pulled their blankets into the center of the room, away from the walls, and they huddled together in the darkness. He wrapped his arms around her, his body a solid, warm shield against the storm. She pressed her face into his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart, a counterpoint to the chaos outside. The world could rage, it could scream, it could try to tear them apart, but here, in this small space they had built together, they were steady, they were safe, they held on to each other, and they did not fall. The storm passed with the dawn, leaving the air scoured clean and the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. Clara rose first. She put on a simple cotton dress she had sewn herself from a bolt of fabric traded for a few of Eli's carved figures at a passing trapper's camp. She walked out of the cabin and to the edge of the canyon rim that bordered their land. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the eastern sky in brilliant strokes of orange and pink and gold. The air was cool and sweet. She stood there, watching the world be born anew, and felt a peace so deep it felt like a prayer. Her past was not gone, but its wounds had become scars, and scars were a testament to survival. She heard a footstep behind her and turned. Eli was there, his face soft in the morning light. He had washed, and his hair was still damp. He walked to her and stood beside her, his good shoulder brushing against hers as they watched the sun crest the horizon, flooding their small meadow with golden light. He said nothing, but he held out his hand. In his palm, resting on the calloused lines of his skin, was a small, smooth ring carved from the pale wood of the cottonwood tree. It was simple and unadorned, but it held the grain of the wood, the warmth of his hands, the promise of the life they were building. She looked from the ring to his face, and her eyes filled with tears. But for the first time in her life, they were not tears of sorrow, or shame, or fear. They were tears of peace. She held out her hand, and he slipped the wooden ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. He drew her to him, his hands cupping her face. He looked at her, his eyes full of a love that needed no words, and he kissed her. It was a kiss that held the quiet of the sunrise, the strength of the canyon rock, and the fierce, tenacious beauty of a wildflower blooming in the desert. The wind rushed past them, a clean, wild song, and the vast canyon below them no longer looked like a place to fall, but a place from which they had, finally, risen together. Thank you for joining us around the campfire for this story. We would love to hear where you are listening from in the comments so we can all connect. Please subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.